Section 3 of Chapter 4 of the GDPR deals with impact assessment and prior consultation. Often, after there's been a problem, people might say, well, we could have told you that was going to happen. What did you expect? Did you not think about that? Did you not consider all of the issues in advance? And Section 3 addresses that issue. Article 35 introduces the idea of a data protection impact assessment. And so this is a requirement to document possible problems in advance of deploying something. It states that where a type of processing, in particular using new technologies, the processing is likely to result in a high risk, the controller shall, prior to the processing, carry out an assessment of the impact of the envisaged processing operations on the protection of personal data. So when dealing with high-risk data, or indeed new technologies, the controller is obliged to consider potential problems and consider the issues and the risks in advance. Article 35(2) sets out that the controller shall seek the advice of the data protection officer. So again, we have this data protection officer coming up. We're going to address that role a little bit later. A data protection impact assessment is necessarily required in certain scenarios. So you'll need a data protection impact assessment where there's going to be a systematic and extensive evaluation of personal aspects relating to natural persons, which is based on automated processing, and on which decisions are based that produce legal effects or similarly significant effects for the natural person. So where there's going to be widespread and extensive processing, like profiling, and where that could have consequences for people, you will have to do a data protection impact assessment. You'll also need an impact assessment if there's going to be processing on a large scale of special categories of data referred to in Article 9.1. Now those are the ethnic origin, sexual orientation, religion categories, those highly sensitive ones that you really want to stay clear of if at all possible. Or if you're processing information about criminal convictions, then you'll need a data protection impact assessment too. You'll also need a data protection impact assessment if there's going to be systematic monitoring of a publicly accessible area on a large scale. So facial recognition technology fits into this category, for example. Location data of people's mobile phones fits into this category, if it's being actively monitored in real time anyway. Tracking cars using number plate readers, or even something like using the RFID chips in student ID cards as a way of monitoring attendance. Anything that's systematic in a publicly accessible area and on a large scale will trigger the requirement for a data protection impact assessment. Article 35(4) specifies that, notwithstanding the details in the previous sections, the supervisory authority can also make a list of the kinds of processing that will require a data protection impact assessment. So the list could even be more extensive. And quite helpfully in Article 35(5), the supervisory authority can also make a list of the kinds of data processing that do not require a data protection impact assessment. Article 35(7) then goes into the details of what would be in the data protection impact assessment. And at a minimum, it will contain a systematic description of the envisaged processing operations and the purposes of the processing, including, where applicable, the legitimate interest pursued by the controller. Now, this is something that the data controller would have to document in any event. It will require an assessment of the necessity and proportionality of the processing operations in relation to the purposes. So the data controller will have to specify the purpose of the processing and then explain how the processing is necessary and a proportional way of meeting those objectives. There will need to be an assessment of the risks to the rights and freedoms of the data subjects. So the risks to the data subjects will need to be considered and evaluated and documented. The data protection impact assessment will then need to identify the measures envisaged to address those risks, so the safeguards, security measures, and mechanisms to ensure the protection of the personal data, and to demonstrate compliance with the GDPR. In Article 35.8, we see that compliance with approved codes of conduct can be taken into account there. And Article 35.9 states that where appropriate, the controller shall seek the views of the data subjects or their representatives on the intended processing. So there may be prior consultation with the data subjects. So if Cork City Council wanted to deploy tracking sensors throughout the city, it would likely be required to have a consultation with the citizens of Cork to see how they feel about that. If MTU wanted to use RFID tags in students' ID cards to automatically record attendance, it would probably need a consultation with the students or their representatives, would be the Students' Union, to see if that's a good idea or not. Article 35.11 then places an ongoing obligation on the data controller to ensure that the data is being processed in a way that is in accordance with the data protection impact assessment and requires the controller to reevaluate the impact assessment if the risk profile changes, for example. So data protection impact assessments are a big deal. Very often it's a government body that wants to carry out the kind of processing that might require a data protection impact assessment. But of course, a corporate data controller might be doing some kind of processing that could trigger those provisions also. Data protection impact assessments can be quite extensive, and you can even see a business opportunity there in developing these and producing these for organisations. Article 36 specifies that the controller might have to consult with the supervisory authority depending on the outcome of the impact assessment. If it indicated that the processing would result in a high risk. So the data controller and the supervisory authority might engage in a consultation and some back and forth. One might even call it a negotiation, although in fairness the supervisory authority has all the cards. But there are some specific provisions set out for that, and we see some of that business in Article 36.2. Article 36.3 specifies some of the specific information that the controller will provide to the supervisory authority. This will include the responsibilities of the controller and any processors, the purposes and means of the intended processing, the measures and safeguards in place, once again, the contact details of the data protection officer, the data protection impact assessment, and then any further information that might be requested. So if the processing is the type that would require a data protection impact assessment and also require consultation, there's some fairly stringent communication requirements there between the controller and the supervisory authority, and all this of course happens before there's any data collected. That's the whole point. It's prior consultation in advance of the processing of the data. And the hope is that any problematic data processing might be avoided before it ever happens. So rather than closing the barn door after the horse has bolted, we evaluate the situation first and come up with some appropriate metaphor.